Good evening. We're going to be looking this evening at Zephaniah, and like I did last week, we're going to be looking with the outline that we usually do with the Bible classes as we finish up. If you didn't get one of the outlines and want one, just raise your hand, and I've got my man on the spot over here, Stephen. Okay, he'll bring you one. So anyway, Zephaniah is the next one of the minor prophets we're looking at. And I did things a little bit out of order today, and hopefully that won't confuse you too much. The sermon this morning was from the book of Haggai. And Haggai is what is referred to as a post-exilic prophet or book. And like I say, you don't have to remember that. But what it means is he wrote about the time after the exile, that when the southern kingdom, Judah, was taken into exile, and when they came back, Haggai talks about that time. Well, Zephaniah is before the exile, before they're taken into captivity. And so he's the last one of the ones that writes before that. So we're dropping back about 80 or 90 years previous to where we are in Haggai. I wanted to do the lesson in Haggai in particular because of the element about time and the time change today, and recognizing that, we're thinking about time more and all of that when it comes to the time change and what all that means. And so that's why I included that for our thoughts this morning. But tonight, back into the order that we're going through, Zephaniah is still before the southern kingdom of Judah is taken into captivity. And being the last of the books, there is certainly an understanding that it's not going to be long. It's going to take place pretty soon. Zephaniah is introduced in verse 1 of chapter 1, and it says about him that he is the son of Cushai, the son of Gedaliah, the son of Amariah, the son of Hezekiah. You recognize Hezekiah as one of the kings of Israel. And he says, in the days of Josiah, the king of Ammon, the king of Judah. Zephaniah was a part of the royal family, apparently, but not one of the kings. He would have been a cousin some way or another to the royal family, and also a descendant of Hezekiah, one of the best kings of Judah. And Zephaniah, preaching and teaching when he does, the king during his time was Josiah. And Josiah was one of the absolute best kings of all of Judah. If you were to look probably at what the greatest king was, it'd have to be David. And if you were to quantify who was probably the next best king, as far as doing what was right and following after God, Josiah would be a pretty good argument for that spot. Hezekiah would be probably another one. Hezekiah and Josiah and Solomon are probably the next best kings behind King David himself. And so, Zephaniah comes from a lineage of a good king of Hezekiah. And he serves as a prophet during Josiah, one of the best kings. And so, when you've got a good king, you've got a friend at the top, so to speak. Although Josiah doesn't really play into the prophecy, but yet it's a time in which it's better than a lot of the other times. Well, even though there was a good king, and at the moment there were a lot of people doing what was right, not all of the nation did. Some of the previous kings, like Manasseh and Ahab and some of the others that had been along before, some of the other wicked kings that had been a part of their kingdom and the northern kingdom and all of the ones before, had done a lot to move the people away from God. And even though Josiah tried to bring them back, was not completely successful. And when you look at Josiah and you look at Josiah's account, we learn that God had foretold that they would certainly be destroying Judah, but wouldn't do it in Josiah's day because of the way that Josiah had turned his heart toward God. Well, it takes place about 20 years afterwards, after Josiah is done being king. And so at this point, when Zephaniah writes his book, we can kind of date Zephaniah's book to somewhere between 640 and 609 BC, and it's somewhere in the range of 30 to 40 years, maybe as little as 20, before the kingdom is taken away into captivity. So the time's pretty short, and so the urgency is there. Well, anyway, into the text itself. Look at verse 2 of chapter 1. He says, I will utterly sweep away everything from the face of the earth, declares the Lord. I will sweep away man and beast. I will sweep away the birds of the heavens and the fish of the sea and the rubble with the wicked. I will cut off mankind from the face of the earth, declares the Lord. That sounds pretty harsh, doesn't it? You know, God did such a thing. When we looked on Wednesday night at Genesis 6 through 9, God did such a thing. He sent a great flood in Noah's day, and it covered the whole earth, and it destroyed all those things. And God says this here through Zephaniah, that He's going to destroy all these things. But God made a promise, remember, to Noah, that He wasn't going to destroy everything, that He put the bow in the sky, the rainbow, and that He wouldn't destroy everything. So is God going back on His promise? And well, the answer is no. God is not going back on His promise. But what it is this. God's destruction of Jerusalem and its people is going to be great. It's going to be complete. Literally, are all the fish and birds and everything else going to be destroyed? And the answer is no. And so how do you look at that? How do you understand that? Well, as far as the people, everything is going to be destroyed. And that's what really mattered. What they needed to know is everything they knew, everything they understood, everything the way it was going to be taken care of. That doesn't mean God was going to fail at His purpose and fail at what He was going to do, but just simply that in poetic language, in the language of the prophets, sometimes there are things that are stated that aren't literally coming true, but for perspective, it's coming true. Have you ever made an argument sometimes, and I always try to encourage people not to do this, but have you ever made a comment to someone to say, you always do this or you never do that, but then you knew in your heart that wasn't really true? That yeah, there were sometimes they had or sometimes they hadn't. And sometimes what we're doing is we're trying to magnify our language by saying always or never. We're trying to make it say that things that are a little larger. Sometimes the prophets do that. They're not being disingenuous. They're not being untruthful. God is certainly not lying, but it is just simply to emphasize that nothing, and I mean nothing, is going to escape the judgment that's going to come. He says in verse 4 as it follows on, I will stretch out my hand against Judah and against all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and I will cut off from this place the remnant of Baal and name of the idolatrous priests along with the priests. Those who bow down on the roofs of the house of the heavens, and those who bow down and swear to the Lord, and yet swear by Milcom. Those who have turned back from following the Lord, who do not seek the Lord or inquire of Him. And so He's saying, I'm going to destroy every resemblance of the idol worship that they're doing. I'm going to get rid of all of it. Get rid of all of the wickedness that they were participating in. And that was the problem. They had turned to other things. They were doing other things in relation to worship. They were following after Baal, which was an idol god, and they were doing that, and they were praying and bowing down to these other gods. And God says, I'm done with it. I'm going to destroy everything. I'm going to get rid of all of it. And then let's look in further into the text. In verse 7, this sounds like a little bit like what we looked at last week. Remember in Habakkuk 2:20, let all the world be silent before him. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the world be silent. Well, verse 7 here says, be silent before the Lord God, for the day of the Lord is near. The Lord has prepared a sacrifice and consecrated his guests. And on that day of the Lord's sacrifice, I will punish the officials and the king's sons, and all who array themselves in foreign attire. On that day I will punish everyone who leaps over the threshold, and those who fill their master's house with violence and fraud. On that day, declares the Lord, a cry will be heard from the fish gate, a wail from the second quarter, a loud crash from the hills. Wail, O inhabitants of the mortar, for all the traders are no more. All who weigh out silver are cut off. At that time I will search Jerusalem with lamps, and will punish the men who are complacent. Those who say in their hearts, the Lord will not do good, nor will he do ill. I wanted to read that whole section there to kind of give you a flavor of the book. We're certainly not going to read through all 3 chapters of Zephaniah tonight, but I want to give to you that flavor of what's going on. There are people going about their business each and every day. They're doing their things. They're worshiping their idols, and they're caring about their business. They're going to work. They're going to school. They're learning. They're growing. They're doing the things that people do in a society. But God says there's going to come a day when all the cry will come out, when the message comes out, that when they hear from the fish gate, when they hear from the second quarter, when there's a crash from the hills, when they're surrounded in all ways, there's going to come a day that they hear about the violence that's coming. And he said, in that time, I'll search Jerusalem with lamps. I'll look it over, and you'll punish the men who are complacent. Well, in reality, it didn't have to look very hard, because as a people, as a society, they were complacent. He said, those that say in their hearts, I want you to listen. Do you see people around us? Do you know people that fit this? The Lord will not do good, nor will he do ill. In other words, God's leaving us alone. God's not going to do anything for us, do anything against us. He minds his business up in heaven, and he leaves us alone. Much like the belief that God set everything in order, just kind of went away and just let things go as they may. A lot of people believe that, even that do believe in God. Well, if you were to take a step back and think, and we were to receive a letter from God, a prophecy, a little 3-chapter book sent to America about the things that America is doing that aren't right with God. And there's some things I would suppose would be in there, but I would almost guarantee you there would be a couple verses in there along these lines about complacency. About complacency in regard to, it won't happen to us. Overthrowing countries or doing whatever. That happens to other people. That happened to other nations. That happened somewhere else. We're good. God's blessing us. We put in God we trust on our money. We're good. And I'm afraid that in a lot of ways, our country is the poster child for complacency. And I'm afraid also that some of the reasons why we are having some of the problems we're having all around our country are because many have been complacent for too long and allowed some things to go on and some things to take place that definitely should not have. I think it's part of the anger that is present among us in our nation right now. And clearly, if you've paid even half attention to anything going on in the news and what's going on in the political realm as far as the candidates go, there's one thing that's clear. There's a lot of people mad. What are they mad about? Well, I think a lot of it is because we're kicking ourselves because we've been complacent. If the truth were really told, I'm afraid there's a lot of people on all sides of all issues that have been guilty of complacency. And so one of the things that I've tried to do when we look at these minor prophets is try to draw things out of it that sound a lot like us. And I'm afraid we could say about our nation that many of us go through life saying, oh, it won't be us. God won't do anything to us, either negative or positive. And I think that fits. In verse 13, he says about them, he says, their goods will be plundered and their houses laid waste. Though they build houses, they shall not inhabit them. Though they plant vineyards, they shall not drink the wine from them. The great day of the Lord is near, near and hastening fast. Sound of the day of the Lord is bitter. The mighty man cries aloud there. A day of wrath is that day, a day of distress and anguish, a day of ruin and devastation, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness, a day of trumpet blasts and battle cry against the fortified cities and against the lofty battlements. There is going to come that destruction upon them, and it's going to happen fast. Now, like many of the other prophets, just in case God's people think, okay, God's only picking on us, primarily when you look at the second chapter, you look at chapter 2, what you will notice, chapter 2 focuses on the other nations that are around, that are acting against God's people, that are doing things against them. He does say in the first couple verses, here he says, gather together, yes, gather, O shameless nation, before the decree takes effect, before the day passes away like chaff, before there comes upon you the burning anger of the Lord, before there comes upon you the day of anger of the Lord. Seek the Lord, all you who are humble in the land, who do just commands. Seek righteousness, seek humility. Perhaps you may be hidden on the day of the anger of the Lord. So, let's say you are one of the people in the nation. You're a recipient of the book of Zephaniah. And you know a lot of people are complacent. A lot of people are wicked. A lot of people are bowing down to the idols. And you look at that and you say, well, that's not me. I'm not doing that. He gives them direction to say, those of you that are humble in the land, do God's commands, seek righteousness, seek humility, and perhaps you'll make it through the anger of God. And then he goes around the nations, as I mentioned a couple minutes ago. He goes around the nations. He talks about Gaza and Ashdod and Ekron, and then he talks about the land of the Philistines in verse 5. And by the way, Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ashdod and Ekron are all cities of the Philistines. And so he talks about the destruction coming on them. He talks about their things that are going to happen to them and how that God is going to judge them. How God is going to in verse 7, restore the fortunes of Judah. Then he goes on to verse 8 and talks about Moab and Ammon, the Moabites and the Ammonites, and how they've taunted the people of God and the things that they've said about them and how God is going to treat Moab like Sodom and the Ammonites like Gomorrah in verse 9, and how that he is going to punish them. Then he goes on to verse 12 and talks about the Cushites and how he's going to, how they'll be slain by the sword. And he talks about Assyria and Nineveh in verse 13. And so he goes on and goes through the different nations that have acted against Judah. So what does it come down to? God can punish his people because God is righteous. But these other people that were doing so, whether it be the Philistines, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Cushites, the Assyrians, they're doing it because they're wicked. They're doing it because that's what wicked people do. But God is intending for what is to come upon Judah to be the betterment of Judah and to make Judah come back to him because they had left him. As we go into chapter 3,